The pandemic changed the way we live, work, and survive. 3 years on, Filipinos are still feeling its impact. Rising prices, low wages, and the growing cost of basic needs. But is the average household income keeping up? Are families earning enough to match the soaring cost of living, or are they falling further behind? In this presentation entitled Peso and Prices, a Post-Pandemic Reality, we will look at how inflation, household income, and the cost of living have changed since the pandemic. Join the group second row always as we uncover the number behind the struggle and what it all means for the future of Filipino families.
Good day, everyone. Hi, and welcome to our academic discussion where we will be conducting an investigation surrounding the post-pandemic analysis of the average Philippine household income from 2021 to 2024 in comparison with national interest rates and inflation rates.
Alright, let's start with the problem. We've all noticed that prices have been going up, especially when it comes to food. But here's the big question. How well are Filipino households keeping up with these rising costs?
Yeah, exactly. Food inflation is a big deal. I mean, food is something everyone needs, right? It's a basic necessity. So when the price of food keeps climbing, families have less to spend on other important stuff such as healthcare and education.
That's the thing. If people's wages aren't increasing at the same pace as prices, it's going to be harder to afford basic necessities, which definitely puts a lot of strain on families.
And that's why we need to look closely at things like household income, inflation, and even interest rates. We want to see how all these factors are connected and if they're making life harder for Filipinos.
So how did we approach this problem? Our methodology in analyzing this issue started by first collecting monthly data from 2021 to 2024 on three key factors. First, we looked at the average household income in the Philippines. Then, we gathered the inflation rates, which tell us how quickly prices are increasing every month. Finally, we checked out the interest rates, which are adjusted by the central bank usually in response to inflation to control the economic activity happening within the nation. With all this data that we have gathered, we use the Pearson's correlation coefficient to see if there's any relationship between income growth, inflation, and interest rates. Basically, we wanted to know if income is keeping up with the rising cost of living.
Okay, but why did we exactly pick these three factors specifically?
Great question. So, inflation rates are important because, especially when discussing about the affordability of goods, inflation rates show us just how fast the prices of goods are going up. Interest rates also affect how much it costs to borrow money. And since interest rates are often adjusted based on inflation rates, we thought that these two variables would be key to understanding how the overall economy is affecting everyday Filipinos.
So here's what we found. When we look at the data, we see both inflation rates and household incomes have changed since 2021. The biggest spike happened in early 2023 when inflation reached its highest at 8.7%. But household income only grew by about 3%.
And so, given this data, what exactly does this tell us? Well, it shows that while the cost of living is rising quickly, incomes are not keeping up. This means that families have to stretch their money and resources even further, buying less with the same income.
And that's a big problem. When inflation goes up faster than wages, it makes it harder to afford the things we need, even if incomes are going up a little.
Now let's talk about interest rates. As inflation was rising, the central bank raised interest rates to try to control it. Higher interest rates mean borrowing money becomes more expensive, which is supposed to slow down spending and reduce inflation.
But that also means it's harder for people to borrow money for things like houses or cars, right?
Exactly. Higher interest rates can also slow down the economy because people spend less when borrowing money becomes more expensive. So, while raising interest rates might help control high inflation, it also makes life harder for consumers. So, based on our data that we have gathered, we see how inflation rates peaked at the beginning of 2023, hitting their highest point of 8.7%.
Wait, so what does that really mean, Sean? 8.7%? That sounds like a big number.
Okay, so to break it down, inflation is essentially the rate at which the prices of goods and services rise over time. So, for example, if the inflation rate in January of 2023 was 8.7%, it means that compared to the previous month, the prices of products and services were on average 8.7% higher. This is important because it reflects how much more people have to spend to buy the same things. For families, especially lower income families, this can be huge, especially since when wages aren't keeping up with the price increases, families are no longer able to afford the goods that they once were able to buy.
Got it. So inflation really boils down to prices going up, but aren't we also factoring in things like interest rates and household income?
Exactly. Inflation is one of the key drivers that influence interest rates. Central banks like the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas adjust interest rates to either slow down or stimulate the economy depending on the inflation rate. If inflation is high, the central bank might raise interest rates to make borrowing more expensive. The idea is that if borrowing costs more, people and businesses will spend less, which helps lower the inflation.
Okay, so what does this exactly mean for the average Filipino? How does this all play out in our day to day lives?
So, interest rates really matter because they affect how much it costs to borrow money. If interest rates are low, loans are cheaper, so people might take out loans for things like buying homes, cars, or even smaller purchases. This increases spending, which helps boost the economy because more money is circulating.
Right, but the flip side is that when interest rates go up, borrowing money obviously becomes more expensive, so people are less likely to take out loans or make big purchases. This has a quote unquote cooling effect on our economy, which can in turn make it harder for regular Filipinos to afford major life purchases like a house or a car. This ripple effect means that people who don't borrow money at all might even feel the effects that this have on the economy, because when people stop spending money, businesses can struggle and jobs can be affected as well. So as we dig deeper into the data presented, we want to understand how household income, inflation, and interest rates are all related, or if there is correlation between these variables. To do that, we use the Pearson's rank correlation test, which helps us see if there's any significant relationship between these three variables. In short, we wanted to know if income growth is able to keep up with inflation and interest rates, and if Filipino families are really getting squeezed from all sides of the economy.
And in our data analysis, the results from the Pearson's correlation coefficient test showed an R value of negative zero point 0.1 for the growth rate and inflation rate. In addition, we also tested the R value for the growth rate and interest rate and resulted to negative 0.008, which shows no correlation between any of the factors selected. So, what exactly does this mean?
This highlights how, as inflation and interest rates increase, the growth rate of the income of an average Filipino household did not necessarily increase as well. And so, this showcases an even larger issue, which suggests that one of the main reasons for the lack of affordability in everyday goods is the fact that the average income of families is not keeping up with the growing inflation and interest rates in the Philippines. However, it is important to recognize that no correlation does not necessarily mean no causality. These are two different concepts. And what I'm suggesting is simply a comment on the data given and the analysis given by the Pearson's correlation coefficient.
So, while our data analysis gives us a clear picture, there are some limitations to keep in mind. We weren't able to gather all the data we needed because of some availability issues. This definitely made the research process a bit more challenging.
Yes, exactly. One of the biggest hurdles we face was not having complete data. It's definitely something we had to work around, but besides missing data, it's also important to point out that comparing household income with inflation and interest rates is just one way to understand affordability. There are other factors at play, such as the Consumer Price Index or CPI, that can really help us understand how affordable goods and services are for Filipinos.
Right, Sean, the Consumer Price Index tracks how much the prices of goods and services change over time, and it's a really important data point for looking at the cost of living. Governments and analysts use it to figure out the if price changes are sustainable, and what it means for everyday people if they could afford these prices.
So the question is, what does this mean for Filipinos on the ground? If wages aren't growing at the same pace as inflation, it's clear that many people are struggling just to afford basic necessities, such as food, healthcare, and even transportation. Families are having to make tough decisions about where to spend their limited resources, often sacrificing one need for another. This isn't just about numbers, it's about real lives being affected.
Exactly, and when we zoom out and look at the even bigger picture, this disparity between wages and inflation points to deeper structural issues in the country's economic system. If wages aren't rising fast enough to match the increased cost of living, it's a sign that the system isn't functioning to support the majority of Filipinos, especially those in lower income brackets. This kind of imbalance present not only widens economic inequality, but it also traps people in cycles of poverty, where they can't afford opportunities for education, healthcare, or even housing.
Right, and it's important to remember that these numbers don't exist in a vacuum. They represent real people and their struggles. Every increase in price means the family is feeling more financial strain. These aren't abstract economic terms. They're about families deciding between buying groceries or paying for medicine. These pressures are felt every day in every household, and they're unsustainable in the long run. This highlights the need for policies that don't just react to inflation, but proactively address wage growth and affordability. Without that, we're just perpetuating the same cycle of inequality, and that's something that needs to change. And I also believe that change needs to be needs to be attacked in its roots, such as checking into who are the people, who are the corporations responsible, that needs to be regulated and held accountable.
Okay, so to wrap it up, our research shows that Filipino incomes haven't kept up with the rising prices, making it harder for families to afford everyday needs. This is a serious issue that we need to address.
And while this investigation is a good start, it's just the beginning. We need more research, and more discussions and analysis to find solutions to make life more affordable for Filipino families and have education and data that is science oriented, fact based, mass oriented, and accessible to all.
Our findings show that there's a real need for policies that focus on wage growth and affordability. The government needs to take this issue seriously and make sure that changes will actually benefit the people who need them.
Okay, so thank you for joining us today. We hope this gives you a better understanding of what Filipino families are facing and spark some action to address these issues. Thank you, everyone, and see you soon.
Thank you!